Well, despite the U.S. imposing sanctions on Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa and other officials over alleged election abuses, Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube assured that debt restructuring talks led by the African Development Bank President Akinwumi Adesina and former Mozambican leader Joaquim Chissano are progressing. Now, the U.S. paused its involvement in the discussions, but Ncube emphasizes that the dialogue will continue. This morning, we're joined from Harare, Zimbabwe, by a developmental economist, Dr. Prosper Chitambara. Dr. Chitambara, it's nice to have you around.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we see the finance minister Ncube talking about progression in terms of debt restructuring talks. I'd like you to just, in about a minute or two, look at the specific steps that are being taken that you feel will go a long way in resolving the debt issue for the country.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. No, I think first and foremost, the establishment of the structured dialogue platform itself, I think that's a major success. But it's actually bringing together all the key stakeholders in terms of the debt processes in the country to the table. And they've actually agreed on the steps that must actually be taken in terms of the reform agenda. We have seen as part of that reform agenda, the International Monetary Fund was actually in town as part of the Article 4 consultations. And there is agreement between the government and the National Monetary Fund on a staff monitored program. So the government of Zimbabwe will be entering into a staff monitored program with the National Monetary Fund, where we will agree on macroeconomic reforms that will need to be implemented over a period of time, obviously with technical assistance from the International Monetary Fund. So for me, I think that's a major success. That's a major step forward. But I think now what's most important is to ensure that we move with speed. We expedite the implementation of not just the macroeconomic reforms, but also other governance and the institutional reforms that government has already agreed to implement. Because as we move along in terms of implementation of those reforms, that helps to ensure that the economy is able to grow more sustainably and thus be able to generate incomes and revenues to be able to defray the debt.
We also see the finance minister talking about ongoing token payments, and people are talking about how long Zimbabwe realistically can continue these payments while facing such huge debt and arrears. And there's also the concern if the country might risk a default if a restructuring deal isn't reached soon. So what's your take?
Yes, we have been making some token payments, but given the extent of the debt, it's not going to help us. So I think the most important thing is to ensure that we are able to get our economy to grow more sustainably. Was it the current growth rates? Again, it will be difficult to sustainably address the debt issue. Yes, some restructuring could actually help us, but what restructuring essentially does is that it just postpones the payment of the debt, or it postpones the debt burden. So it doesn't sustainably address the debt problem. So I think we need, for me, the best way is for us to make sure that we implement institutional reforms to unlock the full potential of the economy, to ensure there is greater inflows of capital and investment into the economy, and to ensure that the economy at least is growing at a fast pace. The economy is growing more sustainably. If we're able to grow at least 7% for the next 3 or 4 years, I think that will go a long way in terms of ensuring that we grow the economy and we create adequate revenues to be able to pay back the debt without having to incur further debts.
Well, you sound very optimistic about these debt restructuring talks, but then we see the U.S. pulling out of the deal, which is also a major, it has a major stake in these particular talks, and it cited some democratic reforms that were being violated or were not being put to the letter by the president. Now, don't you think that would have a negative effect on what the Zimbabwean government is trying to achieve in terms of offsetting its debts?
Definitely, you're actually right. It will affect our pace and our progress, especially given the fact that the United States, one of the key stakeholders within the major multilateral financial institutions. So I think the onus is really on the government to implement the governance reforms that address some of the deficits that the US has raised, and also other institutional reforms to ensure that there are no major encumbrances militating against faster and more inclusive and sustained growth within the economy. So I think it's ultimately on us in terms of how soon we're actually able to come out of these debt challenges. So it's really us that will make the process and the outcome successful. Yes, the outside, the external interlocutors are actually there to offer support, but ultimately the burden and the responsibility must be on us to implement the reforms that ensure that whether it's the political space is conducive for businesses, and also the macroeconomic environment itself is conducive for investment inflows.
All right, Dr. Prosper Chitambara, developmental economist, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.